Good evening, all, and welcome back to Fear Knocks. On the Antarctic plateau, night isn't a time of day. It's a season. The horizon never brightens, the wind cuts low across the modules, and every sound carries farther than it should. During winter over, even small anomalies feel louder. A beacon pings from inside the perimeter, then repeats with a timestamp that shouldn't exist. An airlock clicks from the wrong side while the indicator still reads open. A flagged traverse mirrors itself overnight as if the route flipped in place. And a calm voice reads the station's next hour weather before any balloons go up. Tonight's accounts come from winter overlogs, HF recordings, maintenance tickets, and traverse notes marked under frost tape. One incident in this set was almost removed from the archive entirely. You'll understand why when we reach it. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. And keep the bell on. We post every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Your comments help the channel grow. All right, let's get into it. I was the senior comms technician, monitoring the HF bands. It was deep polar night, the temperature well below freezing, inside the Antarctic research station. A distress beacon pinged, but the log showed it had already arrived a minute earlier. My shift had begun like any other, a quiet stretch of the long night cycle. The comms room was a familiar space, filled with the low hum of equipment and the faint crackle of frost static from the HF console. I sat at the main desk, scanning the various frequencies, ensuring all systems were nominal. The station was a bubble of light and warmth against the vast dark expanse of the ice. Outside, the wind often whispered across the perimeter berms, a constant reminder of our isolation. We were a small crew, wintering over, reliant on our systems and each other. The first alert came through the automated monitoring system. A personal locator beacon, or PLB, had activated. The screen displayed the standard packet, a unique identifier, a set of coordinates, and a timestamp. The time read 2:14 in the morning. My immediate thought was to cross-reference the coordinates with our station map. PLBs were for emergencies outside the perimeter, for field teams or supply drops gone wrong. This was standard procedure, a routine check. Then the system chimed again. Another PLB packet, identical to the first. The same identifier, the same coordinates. But the timestamp on this second alert read 2:13. My eyes lingered on the display, a flicker of confusion. The system had just reported a signal from 2:14, and now it was showing the same signal from a minute before that. It was a small detail, a single minute, but it felt wrong. The beacon had sung, then sung again, as if time had briefly reversed itself. Life at the station during the polar night settled into a precise rhythm. Days and nights blurred into a continuous stretch of artificial light, punctuated by shift changes and meal times. My routine involved constant vigilance over the comms systems, ensuring our link to the outside world remained stable, however tenuous. We were cut off, truly isolated, for months on end. The cold was a constant presence, even indoors, a subtle chill that permeated the metal and glass. Our station was designed for self-sufficiency, a small scientific outpost against an immense, indifferent landscape. The perimeter berms, built from compacted snow and ice, offered a measure of protection from the relentless winds and blowing snow. They also served as a clear boundary, a line between our controlled environment and the wilderness beyond. PLBs were critical safety devices, issued to anyone venturing beyond that line. Their signals were our lifeline, a promise of rescue in the event of an emergency. We ran regular drills, practicing our response to various scenarios, including PLB activations. The system was robust, designed for accuracy and redundancy. False alarms were rare, usually attributed to equipment malfunction or accidental activation during maintenance. A genuine distress signal was a serious event, triggering a full station alert and a coordinated response. The thought of a PLB activating inside our secure perimeter was almost unthinkable. It violated every protocol, every assumption about our safety. The silence of the comms room, usually a comfort, now felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. I leaned forward, my fingers hovering over the console. The first packet, time-stamped 214, showed coordinates that placed the beacon directly on the roof of our main station building. The second packet, time-stamped 213, displayed the exact same location. I checked the HF recorder logs, pulling up the raw data. The system had indeed registered the 214 signal first, then the 213 signal a moment later. It was not a display error. The data itself was reversed. The beacon had truly sung out of sequence. My initial thought was a system clock anomaly, perhaps a drift in the internal timing mechanism. I ran diagnostics on the comms console, checking its synchronization with the station's master clock. Everything was nominal. The master clock itself was synchronized with global atomic time, accurate to fractions of a second. There was no logical explanation for the time reversal in the received data. The signal strength was clear, strong, indicating the source was close. I reviewed the PLB identifier. It was not one assigned to any of our current winter-over personnel. All our issued beacons were accounted for, logged, and regularly checked. This was an unknown device, broadcasting from our roof. The implications were immediate and unsettling. Someone, or something, was on the roof, broadcasting a distress signal from an unassigned beacon, and the signal itself was arriving backward in time. I radioed the duty officer, keeping my voice calm, factual. I reported the PLB activation, the coordinates, and the anomalous timestamps. The duty officer, a veteran of several winter-overs, listened without interruption. His response was measured, a quiet instruction to prepare for an external investigation. We needed to confirm the source of the signal and secure the area. The station was on a low-level alert, a quiet hum of readiness. I began preparing my gear. The outside world was a brutal environment. I pulled on my extreme cold weather suit, layers of thermal insulation, a heavy parka, and thick gloves. My headlamp was secured, its beam cutting a sharp path through the dim comms room. I checked my portable radio, ensuring a clear signal. The air in the equipment room, usually warm, felt sharper, colder, as I geared up. The thought of stepping out into the polar night, onto the roof, was always daunting. Tonight, it carried an added layer of unease. The walk to the roof access hatch was short but felt longer than usual. The interior corridors were quiet, most of the crew asleep. The only sounds were the distant thrum of the generators and the soft crunch of my boots on the polished floor. The air grew colder as I approached the hatch, a subtle drop in temperature, indicating the proximity to the exterior. I reached the heavy steel door, its surface cold to the touch, and unlatched it. A blast of frigid air hit me as I opened the hatch. The wind was not severe, but it carried fine particles of frost, stinging my exposed skin. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered roof. The mast cam, mounted near the main antenna array, provided a live feed to the comms room. I had already reviewed the footage from the time of the PLB activation. It showed nothing out of the ordinary, just the swirling snow and the occasional glint of ice. I stepped out onto the roof, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind and the faint hum of the station's ventilation system. I swept my headlamp across the roof, searching for any sign of the beacon or its operator. There was nothing. Just an expanse of undisturbed snow, sculpted by the wind into gentle drifts. I walked slowly, carefully towards the main antenna mast, the coordinates pointing directly to its base. As I approached the mast, my headlamp beam caught something. Footprints. They were partially obscured by the blowing snow, but clearly visible. They led from the edge of the roof, near the access ladder, directly towards the antenna mast. The prints were deep, indicating a heavy weight, and oddly shaped, wider than a standard boot. I followed the trail, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. The prints stopped abruptly at the base of the mast. There was no beacon, no sign of anyone. Then I noticed something else. The footprints led to the mast, but they did not lead away. There was no return trail. The snow around the mast was otherwise undisturbed, save for the prints leading in. It was as if someone had walked to that spot, then simply vanished. I swept my headlamp around the area again, meticulously examining every inch of the roof. Nothing. No other prints. No discarded equipment, no sign of a struggle. The PLB signal had faded completely a few minutes after I stepped onto the roof. I radioed the duty officer, reporting my findings. The footprints, the lack of a return trail, the absence of the beacon. He instructed me to secure the area and return to the comms room. Back inside, I reviewed the mast cam footage again, frame by frame, focusing on the time of the PLB activation. The camera showed only the empty roof, the snow swirling. There was no visible figure, no movement, nothing to explain the footprints or the beacon. The prints had appeared as if from nowhere, then stopped. And the beacon had sung its strange, reversed song. The official investigation yielded no definitive answers. The footprints were photographed, measured, and analyzed. They were indeed anomalous, not matching any of the station's issued footwear. The snow texture suggested they had been made by something heavy, but the precise shape remained a mystery. The PLB signal was never reacquired, its source never identified. The comms logs, with their reverse timestamps, were filed as an unexplained anomaly. Station protocols were reviewed and tightened, though no specific vulnerability could be identified. The incident became a quiet topic of conversation among the winter overcrew, always discussed in hushed tones, without conclusion. Everyone was accounted for. No equipment was missing, and no one had ventured outside the perimeter without authorization. The lack of evidence, combined with the inexplicable nature of the event, left a lingering sense of unease. I still hear it sometimes. The faint, almost imperceptible hum of the HF console. The ghost of frost static. I remember the two distinct pings, a minute apart, the second one arriving before the first, and I recall the image of those footprints, leading into the darkness, but never leading out. The cold silence of the roof, the vast, empty night, and the beacon that sang first, then later. I was a station mechanic, performing a routine check of the module interconnects. It was deep into the Antarctic long night, with only the station's internal lights breaking the constant darkness. I noticed a subtle pressure drop registered on the main control panel for the wind tunnel airlock. The station operated on a strict schedule, even during the months of perpetual night. My shift began just after what passed for midnight, a time when most non-essential personnel were asleep. My duties involved monitoring the structural integrity and environmental systems across the entire complex. This included the long, insulated tunnel that connected the main habitat module to the remote scientific research module, a distance of about a quarter mile. The tunnel was critical for transporting equipment and samples, especially during extreme weather events. My routine involved a physical inspection of the tunnel's airlock doors, checking seals, and verifying sensor readings. The wind tunnel airlock was a double-door system, designed to maintain pressure differentials and prevent heat loss. Each door had its own latching mechanism and an indicator panel showing its status. The system was robust, built to withstand the harshest conditions on the planet. I had worked at the station for several winter overs, and the procedures were ingrained. Every hum of the ventilation, every click of a relay was familiar. The pressure drop was minor, barely a blip on the system log, but it was enough to trigger a maintenance ticket. I gathered my toolkit, a handheld diagnostic tablet, and my heavy-duty parka. The air in the main corridor was kept at a comfortable temperature, but the tunnel itself was colder, a necessary compromise to conserve energy. I walked through the quiet corridors, the only sound my boots on the metal grating. The isolation of the station during the long night was profound, a constant, low hum in the background. I reached the entrance to the wind tunnel, a heavy steel door marked with hazard warnings. I swiped my access card and the door hissed open, revealing the long, dimly lit passage. The air immediately grew colder, and a faint mist, like a low-lying fog, drifted along the floor. This was normal, a result of the temperature gradient between the modules. I began my walk, checking the conduit runs and the integrity of the insulation panels. The tunnel was a lifeline, and its maintenance was paramount. As I approached the midpoint, where the airlock was located, I noticed something unusual. The indicator panel for the outer airlock door, the one leading towards the scientific module, was displaying unlatched. This was odd. Both doors were supposed to be latched unless someone was actively transiting. I checked my diagnostic tablet. It confirmed the sensor reading. I also checked the shift log. No one was scheduled to be in the tunnel at this time. I continued forward, my breath misting in the colder air. The floor fog seemed a little thicker than usual, swirling around my boots. As I got closer to the airlock, I heard a distinct sound. It was a metallic click, followed by a soft thud. The sound seemed to come from the outer door. I stopped, listening. The tunnel was otherwise silent, save for the low hum of the environmental controls and the faint static in my comms earpiece. I waited for a moment, but heard nothing further. I reached the airlock chamber. The inner door, the one I had just passed, was properly latched. But the outer door, the one facing the scientific module, was indeed unlatched. The indicator light was still red. I approached the door, my hand on the cold steel frame. The door was slightly ajar, perhaps an inch or two. A thin ribbon of frost had formed along the edge of the frame, indicating a breach in the seal. This was a significant issue, as it meant a constant drain on the station's heating system. I pushed the door open fully to inspect the latching mechanism. It was a heavy, industrial-grade bar that engaged with a series of bolts. The mechanism appeared to be intact, but it was not engaged. As I examined it, I saw something that made me pause. On the polished steel of the latching bar, there was a clear impression of a gloved hand. The print was distinct, showing the texture of a heavy-duty work glove, the kind we all wore for outdoor tasks. My first thought was that someone had been in the tunnel and forgotten to latch the door, but the shift log showed no activity. I checked the corridor cam feed on my tablet. The camera covered the entire length of the tunnel, including the airlock. I scrolled back through the footage for the last hour. The feed showed the tunnel empty. Then, about 20 minutes prior, the outer airlock door slowly swung inward, just a few degrees. There was no one visible in the frame. A moment later, the door swung back out, almost closing, and then I heard the faint click and thud I had heard earlier. The door was now slightly ajar, as I had found it. The camera feed showed no one entering or exiting the airlock. Yet, the door had moved, and the glove print was undeniable. I zoomed in on the footage, looking for any anomaly, any flicker of movement. There was nothing. The tunnel remained empty. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The isolation of the station suddenly felt more profound, more absolute. I took a photograph of the glove print with my tablet, documenting the evidence. I then manually engaged the latch, securing the outer door. The indicator light immediately turned green. I double-checked the seal, running my hand along the cold metal. It felt secure. I then walked around the airlock chamber, looking for any other signs. The floor fog continued to drift, obscuring the lower parts of the walls. I felt a slight draft, even with the door now latched. I decided to check the scientific module side of the airlock. I walked the remaining distance through the tunnel, the silence pressing in on me. The scientific module was usually quiet at this hour, with only automated experiments running. I reached the inner door of the scientific module, swiped my card, and entered. The air here was warmer, and the lights were brighter. I walked to the other side of the airlock, to the door that connected to the tunnel. This door was also latched, its indicator light green. I examined the latching mechanism. No glove print here. I checked the local corridor cam feed for this side of the airlock. The footage showed no one approaching the door from the scientific module side either. The mystery deepened. The door had unlatched, swung open, and then latched itself again, leaving a glove print, all without anyone visible on camera. I returned to the main control room, my report already forming in my mind. The incident was unusual, bordering on impossible. I reviewed the full system logs for the airlock, looking for any power fluctuations or sensor malfunctions. Everything appeared nominal. The pressure drop had been real, but it was a consequence of the unlatched door, not its cause. I filed a detailed report, attaching the photograph of the glove print and the relevant sections of the camera footage. I marked the incident as unexplained mechanical anomaly. The station chief reviewed my report the next morning. He was a pragmatic man, focused on safety and operational efficiency. He ordered a full diagnostic of the airlock system, including a recalibration of all sensors and a physical inspection by the engineering team. They found no faults. The system was deemed fully operational. The glove print was noted, but without a clear explanation, it remained an oddity. The chief suggested it might have been an old print, somehow made visible by the condensation, though I knew it was fresh. The incident was logged, filed away in the station's extensive records. Life at the station returned to its routine, the long night continuing its slow march. But for me, the quiet dread remained. I found myself checking the airlock cameras more frequently, scrutinizing every frame. Every time I walked through the tunnel, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a whisper of cold that seemed to follow me. The hum of the station, once a comforting sound, now held a different quality, a low, persistent static. I still hear that click sometimes, in the quiet moments. It is a sound that echoes in the deep isolation, a reminder of something that moved in the dark, leaving a mark without a trace. The cold of that tunnel, the way the frost fog drifted, it stays with me. I was the lead power engineer at the South Pole Research Station. It was deep into the long night, with temperatures far below freezing outside. The primary generator's hum shifted almost imperceptibly. My role involved the constant monitoring and maintenance of the station's power grid. We relied on a pair of massive diesel generators, running in parallel, to sustain all operations. The station was a small, self-contained world, a collection of modules under a geodesic dome, isolated by hundreds of miles of ice. Outside, the Antarctic night stretched for months, a perpetual twilight broken only by the aurora. Inside, the hum of the generators was the heartbeat of our survival. I had been on duty for about 3 hours, reviewing load curves and fuel consumption logs. The air in the load center was always cool, a steady 15 degrees Celsius, a stark contrast to the extreme cold beyond the walls. The faint, rhythmic thrum of the machinery was a constant companion, a sound I had learned to interpret with precision. The routine was a precise dance of checks and balances. Every shift began with a walkthrough of the generator shed, a cavernous, insulated building set a short distance from the main station. I would inspect the engines, check fluid levels, and listen to the rhythm of their operation. The two primary generators, designated Alpha and Beta, ran in perfect synchronization, their frequencies locked, their output balanced. Their combined hum was a deep, resonant tone, a sound of controlled power. The station's life depended on this stability. Any deviation, any flicker in the lights, could signal a critical problem. We had backup systems, of course, a third generator for emergencies, but the goal was always to prevent its activation. The isolation of our location meant that any significant failure could have severe consequences. My work was about maintaining that delicate balance, ensuring the continuous flow of electricity that kept us warm, fed, and connected to the outside world. The first real anomaly occurred a little past midnight. I was in the load center, watching the oscilloscopes, which displayed the sinusoidal waveforms of the alternating current. The lines were usually perfectly aligned, a testament to the generator's synchronized operation. That night, however, I noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the light. It was not a flicker, but a faint, slow pulse, a barely visible dimming and brightening that cycled every few seconds. My eyes registered it before my instruments did. I glanced at the scopes. The waveforms remained perfectly superimposed, their peaks and troughs matching precisely. Yet, the light continued its slow, rhythmic pulse. I checked the frequency meters. Both read a steady 60 Hz. The voltage was stable. I walked over to the main panel, placing my hand against the metal. A faint vibration, a subtle tremor, seemed to accompany the light pulse. It was a sensation I had never felt before, a slight discord in the otherwise harmonious hum. I listened intently. The deep thrum of the generators, usually a single, unified sound, now seemed to possess a very faint secondary beat, almost like an echo. It was off by the smallest fraction, a ghost of a sound just behind the primary. I pulled out my audio note recorder, holding it near the panel, capturing the ambient sound. The air felt colder than usual, a sharp, penetrating chill that seemed to seep through the insulated walls. I spent the next hour trying to reconcile what I was seeing and hearing with what the instruments reported. The load scope showed perfect synchronization. The RPM monitor for each generator displayed identical revolutions per minute. The frequency meters were unwavering, yet the light continued its slow, rhythmic dimming and brightening, and the subtle, secondary hum persisted. It was like a faint whisper beneath the main sound, a low, resonant drone that was just a beat behind. I walked back to the generator shed, the cold air biting at my exposed skin as I traversed the short, covered walkway. Inside, the noise was immense, a roaring symphony of diesel engines. I moved from alpha to beta, listening closely to each. Individually, they sounded normal. Their vibrations felt consistent, but when I stood between them, the secondary hum became more pronounced, a distinct, low-frequency beat that seemed to lag the main sound. It was a physical sensation as much as an auditory one, a pressure in my chest. I checked the coupling mechanisms, the fuel lines, the exhaust manifolds. Everything appeared to be in order. There was no visible fault, no leaking fluid, no unusual exhaust plume. The frost on the pipes was uniform, a clear indication of stable temperatures. I returned to the load center, feeling a growing sense of unease. The discrepancy between my senses and the data was unsettling. I decided to isolate one generator to see if the problem persisted. This was a standard troubleshooting procedure, but it carried a slight risk. Running a single generator meant less redundancy and a higher load on the remaining unit. I logged the decision in the station's digital logbook, noting the observed light pulse and the audible phase lag. I began the shutdown sequence for beta. The process was gradual, carefully managed to avoid any power fluctuations. As beta powered down, its hum slowly faded, and the light pulse in the load center ceased. The single, unified hum of alpha filled the space. The oscilloscope showed a single, clean waveform. I ran alpha alone for about 30 minutes. The power was stable, the lights were steady, and the hum was consistent. There was no secondary beat, no lagging echo. This confirmed the issue was related to their synchronized operation. I then brought beta back online, carefully synchronizing it with alpha. The process was precise, involving minute adjustments to beta's engine speed until its frequency matched alpha's. As the two generators locked into phase, the light pulse immediately returned. The faint secondary hum, that lagging beat, was back. It was undeniable. I spent the next few hours running a series of diagnostics. I used a handheld multimeter to check voltage and current at various points in the system, comparing the readings to the load curve sheet. All values were within acceptable parameters. I connected a more sensitive oscilloscope, one typically used for calibration, directly to the output of each generator. When viewed individually, each generator's waveform was perfect. When viewed in parallel, the scope still showed them perfectly synchronized. The visual data contradicted the auditory and sensory input. It was a technical impossibility, a ghost in the machine. I recorded my findings in a detailed report, attaching the audio note I had captured earlier. The cold outside pressed in, a constant reminder of our fragile existence. The isolation of the station amplified the strangeness of the situation. I filed my report with the station chief, detailing the discrepancy. The official response was procedural. The chief reviewed my logbook entries and the diagnostic data. He acknowledged the audible anomaly, but noted the lack of corroborating instrument readings. He suggested a recalibration of the oscilloscopes and frequency meters, a standard response to perceived instrument error. I performed the recalibration, but it changed nothing. The instruments continued to report perfect synchronization, while the light pulsed and the secondary hum persisted. The problem was logged as an unresolved auditory anomaly, with no further action taken. The generators continued to run, their combined hum now forever tainted by that faint, lagging beat. The station continued to function, powered by a system that sounded subtly wrong. I completed my tour and returned home, but the experience stayed with me. The memory of that lagging hum, the faint pulse of the lights, remains vivid. I still hear it sometimes, a quiet echo in the background noise of everyday life. It is a reminder of how easily our perceptions can diverge from what our instruments tell us, and how unsettling that can be. I was a field guide, responsible for maintaining traverse lines across the Sastrugi fields. It was deep into the long night season, with perpetual twilight and temperatures well below freezing. That morning, a flagged route I had set the previous day appeared subtly different. My job involved establishing and maintaining safe routes across the ice, often over hundreds of miles. We used GPS units to record our tracks, and then flagged the path with bamboo poles and reflective markers. The Sastrugi, wind-sculpted snow ridges, could be treacherous, sometimes reaching the height of a small vehicle. Visibility was often poor, with ground fog and blowing frost obscuring the terrain. Our work was methodical, precise, and depended entirely on accurate navigation. We relied on the GPS data and the physical flags to ensure our teams could resupply remote research stations. The isolation out there was profound, a constant, heavy presence. Every decision carried weight. Every measurement had to be exact. The previous day I had laid a new section of traverse, a shallow S-curve around a particularly rough patch of Sastrugi. I had driven the snow machine, carefully planting flags every 100 yards or so, ensuring they were firmly seated in the wind crust. My GPS unit recorded the track, a clean, precise line on the screen. I had taken a few photographs of the flagged line, documenting the initial setup for the logbook. The air was still then, a rare calm, and the flags stood straight, their orange tips a stark contrast against the pale snow. I remember the hum of the snow machine and the crunch of the snow under my boots. It was a routine day, uneventful, just another section of the vast, white expanse. The next morning, I returned to the start of that new section, intending to check the flags for drift and reinforce any that seemed loose. The light was flat and diffuse, typical for the long night, making distances hard to judge. As I approached the first flag, something felt off. The curve of the flags ahead seemed to bend the wrong way. I stopped the snow machine and pulled out my handheld GPS. I loaded yesterday's track, the one I had meticulously recorded. I then walked a few steps along the current flag line, watching my real-time position on the GPS screen. My current position was overlaid on the stored track, but it was not matching up. The flagged line I was standing on was a mirror image of the GPS track from yesterday. The shallow S-curve I had laid out, which should have bent gently to the right and then back to the left, was now bending left and then right. It was as if someone had taken my GPS data, flipped it horizontally, and then reflagged the entire section overnight. The flags themselves were identical, the same bamboo poles, the same orange markers. They were planted with the same spacing, the same depth in the snow. I checked the first few flags, pulling at them, confirming their stability. They felt exactly as I had left them. There was no sign of disturbance around their bases, no fresh snowmobile tracks other than my own. The wind had picked up slightly, a low whisper across the Sastrugi, making the flags rattle faintly. I walked the entire section, about 3 miles, comparing the physical flags to the GPS track. Every single flag was in the mirrored position. The S-curve was perfectly inverted. It was not a slight deviation or a miscalculation on my part. It was a precise left-to-right flip. I checked my GPS unit's settings, ensuring it was displaying the correct orientation and datum. Everything was normal. I even checked the raw waypoint export from the previous day, confirming the coordinates matched my original path. The data was unambiguous. The physical world had changed. The cold was biting, but a different kind of chill settled over me. The sheer impossibility of it was unsettling. I took more photographs, documenting the discrepancy, capturing the flagged line and my GPS screen simultaneously. The silence of the ice felt heavier, more profound. I radioed base camp, reporting a route discrepancy and requesting a second opinion. I kept my voice calm, factual, avoiding any hint of the strangeness I felt. A small team arrived a few hours later, bringing another snow machine and their own GPS units. We spent the rest of the day re-examining the section. They confirmed my observations. Their GPS units, loaded with my original track, showed the same mirrored discrepancy. We walked the line together, each of us checking the flags, the snow, the ground for any explanation. There was none. No evidence of another vehicle, no footprints, no signs of human activity. The sastrugi around the flags were undisturbed, the wind crust unbroken. The only tracks were mine from the previous day and our current ones. We even reviewed the drift cam footage from a nearby weather station. The camera, set to capture time-lapse images every few minutes, showed the area. The footage from the previous night showed nothing unusual. The flags were visible, standing as I had left them. There was no period of low visibility, no fog, no blizzard that could have obscured activity. The light simply faded into the long night, and then slowly brightened again. The flags remained static in the frame, yet when we compared the camera's perspective to the physical flags, they were indeed flipped. It was a paradox, a visual and navigational impossibility. The team leader, a seasoned veteran of many seasons, simply shook his head. He had no explanation. The cold seemed to seep deeper into my bones. We eventually reflagged the entire section, following my original GPS track. We pulled up every one of the mirrored flags and replanted them in their correct positions. It was a slow, painstaking process, made more difficult by the growing unease among the team. We didn't speak much, just the crunch of our boots and the occasional rattle of a pole. The incident was logged in the official report as an unexplained route anomaly. There was no further investigation. The data was filed, the photographs stored. The incident was closed, but the questions remained. I still think about that traverse, the way the world seemed to fold in on itself. The memory of that mirrored path still lingers. I sometimes feel the cold of that long night, the quiet hum of the snow machine, and the unsettling silence of the ice. The image of those flags, perfectly inverted, remains clear in my mind. I was a glaciology technician, mapping crevasse fields for a new traverse route. It was the long night in Antarctica, a season of perpetual darkness and extreme cold. That day, The ground beneath the sled felt subtly different, a thin crunch that was not quite right. My work involved operating a ground-penetrating radar unit, towed behind a snowmobile. The GPR sled was a robust piece of equipment, designed for the harsh polar environment. We were charting a path across a known crevasse zone, an area notorious for hidden hazards. The objective was to identify safe corridors for heavy equipment. This particular section of the ice sheet was vast and featureless, a flat expanse of wind-scoured snow and ice. The cold was constant, a pervasive presence that seeped into everything. Our base camp was many miles distant, a small cluster of heated modules against the endless white. The isolation was profound, broken only by the hum of the snowmobile engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. We worked in shifts, maintaining a steady pace, collecting data points hour after hour. The GPR screen displayed a continuous profile of the ice, revealing the hidden architecture beneath our tracks. Our routine was precise, almost ritualistic. Each morning, after a brief check of the equipment, we would set out into the darkness. The snowmobile headlights cut a narrow beam through the gloom, illuminating only the immediate path ahead. The GPR unit emitted a low hum, a constant companion to the engine's thrum. My role was to monitor the radar display, marking any anomalies or potential crevasse signatures. We maintained a detailed logbook, recording every pass, every significant reading. The data was crucial for the safety of future expeditions. The air temperature typically hovered well below freezing, sometimes dropping significantly lower. Our insulated gear provided protection, but the cold always found a way to penetrate. The crevasse fields were a dynamic environment, constantly shifting under the immense pressure of the ice sheet. New fissures could open, and old ones could fill with snow, creating deceptive bridges. Our GPR was designed to detect these hidden voids, mapping their depth and width. The display showed a series of colored lines and patterns, representing different ice layers and subsurface features. A crevasse appeared as a distinct parabolic signature, a clear indication of a void. We learned to interpret these patterns with accuracy, distinguishing between minor ice fractures and major hazards. The work demanded constant vigilance and a methodical approach. There was no room for error in this landscape. It happened during a routine pass, late into one of the long Antarctic nights. The GPR screen was displaying its usual patterns, a steady flow of data. I was focused on a section where the radar indicated a series of smaller, partially filled crevasses. These were common, often bridged by compacted snow, but still required careful mapping. The snowmobile was moving at a consistent, slow speed, perhaps 5 miles an hour. The engine hummed, and the sled runners made a thin crunching sound on the hard snow surface. The air was still, the cold biting, but otherwise it was a typical shift. Then, a single distinct anomaly appeared on the GPR display. It was not a typical crevasse signature. Instead, a narrow, vertical band of intense resonance briefly flared across the screen. It was a solid, almost luminous line, unlike anything I had seen before. Simultaneously, a sound registered on the GPR's audio output. The unit was designed to translate certain radar reflections into audible tones, helping operators identify specific subsurface features. This sound was unlike any standard output. It was a low, hollow note, a sustained resonance that lasted for perhaps a second, then vanished. It was deep, almost guttural, a sound that seemed to originate from far beneath the ice. I immediately stopped the snowmobile. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the faint static from the radio. I replayed the last few seconds of the GPR data. The visual anomaly was clear, a bright, singular line. The audio output, however, remained silent on the replay. The system had not logged the sound as a distinct event, only the visual spike. I tried to isolate the exact point on the screen where the anomaly occurred. It was a small, filled slot, barely a few feet wide, showing a dense snow infill. The radar indicated solid ice beneath, a hard bridge. Yet, the sound had been undeniable. A deep, resonant hum. I checked the GPR unit's diagnostics. All systems reported normal operation. The antenna array was secure, the power supply stable. I ran a quick calibration check. Everything was within parameters. I looked out across the featureless expanse of snow. There was nothing visible, no change in the terrain. The cold pressed in, and the isolation felt more acute than usual. I considered the possibility of interference, perhaps a stray radio signal or an internal system glitch. However, the GPR was shielded, and the area was remote, far from any other electronic emissions. The sound had been too distinct, too localized to the specific GPR reading. I decided to retrace my path. I backed the snowmobile up slowly, following my previous tracks. I wanted to pass over that exact spot again, to see if the anomaly would repeat. The GPR display showed the same subsurface profile, the same filled slot. I watched the screen intently, listening for any audio output. Nothing. The radar passed over the exact coordinates, but the screen remained normal. No bright line, no hollow note. I made another pass, then a third, each time with the same result. The anomaly was gone, as if it had never occurred. The snow beneath the sled still felt thin in that area, a subtle difference in resistance, despite the GPR indicating a solid bridge. I spent the next hour making repeated passes over the area, widening my search pattern slightly. I adjusted the GPR's frequency settings, trying different penetration depths. I even tried varying the speed of the snowmobile. Each attempt yielded only normal readings. The filled slot appeared exactly as it should, a typical snow-filled crevasse, bridged by solid ice. There was no visual spike, no audio resonance. It was as if the event had been a momentary hallucination, a trick of the long night. But I knew what I had seen and heard. The data log, though missing the audio, still contained the visual spike, a brief, intense blip that defied standard interpretation. I marked the precise location with a probe stake, pushing it deep into the snow. The stake notes recorded the exact coordinates and the details of the anomaly. I also took a series of photographs of the surrounding terrain, though there was nothing unusual to capture. The cold was a constant companion, sharpening the edges of my focus. I felt a quiet unease, a sense of something fundamentally out of place. This was not a mechanical failure or a data error. It was a singular event, an unrepeatable occurrence that left no clear evidence. I radioed back to base camp, providing a concise report of the incident. I described the visual anomaly and the distinct, hollow note. The dispatch operator acknowledged the report, noting it in the daily log. They suggested a thorough equipment check upon my return, a standard procedure for any unusual readings. I understood the protocol. My report would be filed, an unusual entry in a long list of routine data points. I knew it would be dismissed as an isolated glitch, perhaps a phantom reading. The rest of my shift passed without further incident. The GPR continued its steady hum, mapping the crevasse field with predictable accuracy. But my attention remained fixed on that one spot, that single, unrepeatable event. Every time the sled passed over a similar filled crevasse, I found myself listening intently, waiting for the hollow note to return. It never did. The snow beneath my tracks continued its thin crunch, a sound that now carried a subtle, unsettling undertone. The isolation of the vast ice sheet felt heavier, more profound. Upon returning to base, I meticulously checked the GPR unit. I examined every cable, every connection, every sensor. I ran extensive diagnostic tests. The unit performed flawlessly, reporting no errors or malfunctions. I reviewed the raw data from that specific pass, zooming in on the exact moment of the anomaly. The visual spike was undeniably there, a brief, intense burst of energy return. It was an outlier, a data point that did not fit the established patterns. I cross-referenced it with other passes, looking for similar signatures. There were none. The logbook entry detailed the anomaly, a factual account of an unexplainable event. My official report detailed the GPR anomaly and the accompanying audio event. It was filed under Unexplained Data Spike, a category reserved for readings that defied standard interpretation. The incident was reviewed by the lead glaciologist, who concluded it was likely an environmental interference or a transient sensor artifact. There was no evidence to suggest otherwise. The data was archived, a small, peculiar entry in a vast collection of ice sheet profiles. I continued my work, mapping other sections of the crevasse fields. The routine resumed its predictable rhythm. Yet, the memory of that single, hollow note persisted. I often found myself replaying it in my mind, trying to identify its source, its nature. The sound had been too distinct, too resonant to be easily dismissed. It was a sound that seemed to come from a place beyond our understanding of the ice. The cold, the darkness, and the immense isolation of the Antarctic night now carried a different weight for me. The crevasse field was eventually mapped and the traverse route established. My time in Antarctica concluded, and I moved on to other projects. But the memory of that single, unrepeatable event remains. Sometimes, in the quiet of a cold night, I still hear it. It is a deep, hollow note, a sound that echoes from beneath the ice, a whisper from a place that should be silent. It was a sound that spoke once, then never again, leaving only the profound question of what could have produced it. I was the lab manager at a remote research station in the far north. It was deep into the long night season, with temperatures well below freezing. A routine check revealed a slight temperature increase in the primary sample freezer. The station operated year-round, a small cluster of buildings against a vast, silent wilderness. My responsibilities included maintaining the integrity of all scientific equipment and the long-term biological samples. This meant daily checks of environmental controls, power systems, and, most critically, the ultra-low temperature freezers. The air outside was consistently 40 degrees below zero, sometimes even colder. Inside the lab, the hum of machinery was a constant, reassuring presence, a sign that everything was functioning as it should. The isolation was profound, broken only by scheduled radio checks with the nearest town, many miles away. My shift began just before midnight, a typical start during the months of perpetual darkness. I moved through the quiet corridors, the only sounds my footsteps and the distant thrum of the generators. The sample freezer room was kept at a steady 20 degrees below zero, a buffer against the extreme cold outside. Inside this room stood the large chest-style freezer, designed to hold samples at a stable 40 degrees below zero. Its digital readout was usually a solid, unchanging number. On this particular night, the display showed a reading of 35 degrees below zero. This was an immediate flag. A 5-degree increase in temperature was significant for samples requiring such precise conditions. I checked the external temperature sheet, confirming the ambient lab temperature was stable. The data logger connected to the freezer should have recorded any fluctuations. I pulled up the system on my console, reviewing the past few hours of readings. The graph showed a gradual, steady rise over the last 6 hours, starting from its normal set point. There was no alarm triggered, which was unusual for such a deviation. The system was designed to alert for even minor changes. I approached the freezer, its metal casing cold to the touch, but not unusually so. The quiet hum of its compressor was steady, indicating it was still running. I ran my hand along the thick, insulated lid, feeling for any drafts or unusual vibrations. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the power connection, ensuring it was secure. All indicators suggested normal operation, yet the internal temperature continued to climb, slowly but persistently. The air in the room felt still, the cold biting at my exposed skin as I worked. The first physical anomaly I noticed was around the main gasket seal. This seal was crucial, a thick rubber barrier designed to prevent any thermal exchange with the warmer lab air. Normally, a thin layer of rime frost might form on the outside of the gasket, a natural consequence of condensation from the lab air meeting the cold surface. Tonight, the frost was building from the inside of the gasket outward. It was a fine crystalline layer, growing like a delicate white fungus. This was impossible. The freezer was a sealed unit, its internal environment dry and cold. Frost should not form from within. I opened the lid, a blast of colder, dense air rising from the chamber. The internal temperature reading immediately jumped a few degrees as the sensor reacted to the influx of lab air. I quickly scanned the racks of samples, looking for any obvious signs of thawing or damage. Everything appeared frozen solid. The samples were stored in clear plastic jars, each containing smaller vials. I noticed a faint, milky film on the inside surface of one of the jars, near the top. It looked like someone had breathed on the glass, leaving a temporary fog that had then frozen. This jar was sealed, its contents undisturbed. I retrieved the jar, my gloved hand brushing against the cold plastic. The fog was indeed on the inside, a thin, opaque layer that obscured the vials within. I took a photograph with my handheld device, documenting the anomaly. The image would be part of my report. I placed the jar back carefully and closed the freezer lid, ensuring a tight seal. The temperature readout began its slow descent, but it was still several degrees above its set point. The internal frost on the gasket continued to grow, a silent, creeping presence. I spent the next hour monitoring the data logger, watching the temperature graph. It stabilized a few degrees warmer than normal, then began to fluctuate slightly, a degree up, a degree down. The outside air temperature continued to drop, a clear, cold night stretching across the vast landscape. The station's isolation felt more pronounced than usual. I checked the other freezers in the room. Their temperatures were stable, precisely at their set points. Only the primary sample freezer was affected. The quiet hum of the machinery in the room seemed to take on a different quality, a subtle shift in its rhythm. I decided to initiate a full diagnostic. This involved shutting down the freezer, allowing it to warm slightly, and then restarting it. Such a procedure carried risks, but the alternative was to leave the samples at an elevated temperature, potentially compromising years of research. Before I could proceed, I needed to transfer the most critical samples to a backup unit. This process took a few hours, carefully moving each rack, ensuring no exposure to the warmer lab air. The air in the freezer room grew colder as I worked, the outside temperature continuing its descent. As I emptied the primary freezer, the internal frost on the gasket became more visible. It was thicker now, a solid ridge of white ice extending further from the seal. The milky fog on the jar had not dissipated. It remained frozen to the inner surface. I took more photographs, documenting the progression. The procedural nature of my work kept my focus, but a quiet dread began to settle. The observations defied the laws of physics as I understood them. A sealed, actively cooling unit should not be generating internal frost, nor should its temperature rise while the external environment plummeted. Once the samples were secured, I initiated the shutdown sequence. The hum of the compressor ceased, replaced by an unsettling silence. I left the lid ajar for a short time, allowing the internal temperature to equalize with the freezer room. Then, I closed it and restarted the unit. The compressor kicked back on, its hum returning, but it sounded different, a little strained. I watched the display, expecting a rapid drop in temperature. It descended, but slowly, agonizingly so. It struggled to reach its set point, hovering a few degrees above it. The next few days were a blur of monitoring and reporting. I filed a detailed report, including all photographs and data logger readings. The station chief reviewed my findings, his expression unreadable. He contacted the equipment manufacturer, describing the inverse thermal creep and internal frost reversal. Their technicians were baffled. They suggested a faulty sensor, but the evidence of the internal frost and the fog jar contradicted that. The freezer was eventually replaced, a new unit flown in on a cargo plane, its arrival a rare break in the station's isolation. The old freezer was crated and shipped back for analysis. I never heard the official findings. The incident was logged, filed, and eventually faded from daily conversation. The new freezer maintained its temperature perfectly, its hum a steady, reliable sound. Life at the station returned to its normal, isolated rhythm. But the memory of that internal frost, growing against all logic, remained. The image of the fogged jar, like a breath frozen in time, sometimes resurfaced. The quiet hum of the freezers still feels different to me sometimes. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in its tone. I was the safety officer at Outpost Delta, monitoring the perimeter during the long winter night. The air temperature had dropped to nearly 60 degrees below zero, and a blizzard had been building for hours. My first indication of trouble was a flicker on the distant runway marker display. The outpost was situated on a high plateau, a remote research facility in the far northern reaches. My role involved overseeing all external operations and maintaining the integrity of the station's safety systems. This included the automated hazard lights that delineated our primary landing strip, a critical lifeline for supply flights. The blizzard had intensified steadily, reducing visibility to mere feet. Inside the main operations cabin, the hum of the generators was a constant, reassuring presence. I was reviewing the automated system logs, a routine check during severe weather events. The external cameras were mostly useless, obscured by the dense, driving snow. The marker lights were designed to pierce through such conditions, their high-intensity LEDs calibrated for maximum penetration. One of them, designated Marker 7, registered a brief power fluctuation, then stabilized. I made a mental note to check its housing during the next weather window. Our daily routine at Outpost Delta was dictated by the extreme environment. The long night meant perpetual darkness, broken only by the station's floodlights and the distant glow of the runway markers. Each day involved meticulous checks of equipment, fuel levels, and communication systems. The isolation was profound, a constant presence that shaped every interaction. We relied heavily on our instruments and established protocols. Weather conditions were logged every hour, drift lines measured, and equipment integrity verified. My office, a small room off the main operations center, contained monitors displaying environmental data and the status of various remote sensors. The radio was always on, a low static hum filling the background, connecting us to the nearest supply hub, hundreds of miles away. We were a small crew, highly trained, accustomed to the silence and the cold. The procedural nature of our work was a comfort, a bulwark against the vast, unforgiving wilderness outside. We understood the risks inherent in our location and respected the power of the elements. Every system had redundancy, every contingency planned. About an hour after the initial flicker, the blizzard reached its peak. The wind howled like a living entity, rattling the reinforced windows of the operations cabin. The external temperature had dropped further, the air so cold it felt brittle. I was monitoring the runway marker display again, watching the automated system report. Marker 7, the one that had flickered, now showed a complete power failure. Its indicator light on my console was dark. This was not entirely unexpected during a severe whiteout. Snow could accumulate on the solar panels, or a connection could freeze. The protocol was to wait for a break in the weather before dispatching a maintenance team. However, another anomaly appeared almost immediately. Marker 6, the next light downwind from 7, began to register an unusual power draw. Its brightness reading on the console spiked, then held steady at an elevated level. This was contrary to normal operation. Hazard lamps were designed for consistent output. I cross-referenced the data with the mastcam feed for Marker 6. The camera, though heavily obscured by spindrift, still offered a vague shifting image. Through the swirling white, the light from Marker 6 appeared unnaturally intense. It seemed to pulse with a raw, almost aggressive energy, cutting through the blizzard with a clarity that felt wrong. The light was too bright, too focused, for the distance it was supposed to cover. I pulled up the schematics for the marker lights. They were spaced at regular intervals, about a quarter-mile apart, along the runway's edge. Marker 6 was a standard unit, identical to all the others. Its power output was fixed. Yet, the display insisted it was burning at a significantly higher intensity. I checked the drift log. The wind direction was consistent, blowing from Marker 7 towards 6. This meant Marker 6 was downwind. The snow was piling up in deep drifts, especially on the upwind side of any obstruction. Marker 7, now dark, was likely buried or damaged by the wind-driven ice. The visual impression from the mast cam was unsettling. The light from Marker 6 seemed to distort the very fabric of the whiteout around it. It created a tunnel of visibility, a narrow cone of intense illumination that appeared to shorten the distance to the pole. My eyes struggled to reconcile the known distance with the perceived proximity. It looked as though the lamp was only a few hundred feet away, not a quarter mile. The light was too sharp, too defined, given the extreme conditions. It was like staring into a powerful headlight at close range, even though I knew it was far off. The hum of the cabin generators seemed to fade slightly, replaced by the whisper of the wind outside, a sound that now felt less like natural weather and more like a deliberate presence. I took a photograph of the console display, documenting the unusual power readings. The data was clear, but the visual was disturbing. I initiated a Level 2 hazard report, detailing the power failure of Marker 7 and the anomalous brightness of Marker 6. The report went into the station's central file, automatically flagging it for review by the operations chief. My next step was to attempt a remote diagnostic on Marker 6. I accessed its internal systems, running a series of checks on its power regulator and LED array. All diagnostics returned normal. The system reported no faults, yet the output remained elevated. This was a contradiction that defied the engineering specifications. I contacted dispatch over the radio, providing a concise update on the situation. The static on the line was heavier than usual, making the connection tenuous. The dispatcher acknowledged the report, advising caution and reiterating the standing order against external excursions during a whiteout. I understood the protocol. Sending a team out in these conditions was a last resort, reserved for critical failures that threatened the entire station. A single runway marker, even a malfunctioning one, did not meet that threshold. I spent the next few hours meticulously reviewing all available data. I cross-referenced the current weather readings with historical blizzard data. I looked for precedents of light lensing or atmospheric distortion that could explain the visual effect. There were documented cases of light refraction in extreme cold, but never to this degree, never creating such an illusion of proximity and intensity. The mast cam continued to transmit, its image a swirling vortex of white, with the unnaturally bright point of Marker 6 at its center. The light seemed to draw the eye, to pull focus, making everything else recede into the featureless void. It was a beacon that felt less like a guide and more like a lure. I considered the possibility of a sensor malfunction, but the power draw was consistent across multiple internal sensors within the lamp housing. The data was robust. The only variable was the visual perception. I tried to filter the mast cam feed, adjusting contrast and brightness, but the core anomaly persisted. The light was simply too bright for its distance, too clear for the blizzard. It felt wrong, a violation of the expected physics of light and weather. The cold outside pressed against the cabin, a palpable weight. I felt a growing sense of unease, a quiet dread that had nothing to do with the procedural aspects of my job. It was the kind of feeling that settled deep, a primal response to something that simply did not fit. I made a note in the logbook, detailing my observations and the lack of a technical explanation. The blizzard broke about 8 hours later, leaving behind a landscape sculpted by deep snowdrifts. As soon as conditions permitted, a maintenance team was dispatched to the runway. They first located Marker 7, finding its housing completely encased in a solid block of wind-driven ice. The solar panel was shattered and the power conduit severed. It was a complete loss, consistent with the system failure. Then they reached Marker 6. The team reported finding the lamp housing entirely clear of snow and ice, despite being downwind of the heaviest drifts. The wind had scoured the pole in the lamp, leaving it pristine. Its internal diagnostics, when checked on site, showed normal power output. The elevated readings I had observed during the whiteout were gone. The light was burning at its standard intensity, a steady, unremarkable glow. The team found no evidence of tampering or malfunction. Their report concluded that the anomalous brightness was likely an optical illusion caused by the extreme whiteout conditions, possibly exacerbated by the unique way the wind had cleared the lamp housing. The official file was closed with this explanation. I accepted the official explanation. It was the most logical conclusion, grounded in known atmospheric phenomena. Yet, the memory of that light persists. I still see it sometimes in my mind's eye. That impossibly bright, too close beacon in the heart of the whiteout. It felt like an eye, watching, drawing me in. The way it cut through the storm, creating its own pocket of distorted reality, remains unsettling. I know what the instruments said, and I know what the team found. But the image of that lamp, burning with an unnatural intensity, still carries a quiet hum of unease, a whisper of something beyond simple refraction. I was the inventory lead for the station's fuel supply, responsible for the integrity of our reserves. It was the heart of the long night, a period of perpetual darkness and extreme cold. My routine perimeter check revealed an anomaly near the main fuel stack. My role involved meticulous oversight of all consumables, especially the stored diesel. The station relied on these reserves for power, heat, and vehicle operation. During the Antarctic long night, resupply was impossible, making every liter critical. My daily inspection route covered the main storage bladders, the drum stacks, and the transfer pumps. This was a solitary task, performed in the biting cold and the pervasive hum of the station's distant generators. The air was always still, the silence profound beyond the immediate vicinity of the buildings. The fuel berms were located about a kilometer from the main station complex. I typically drove a tracked utility vehicle, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The path was marked by a series of reflective poles, barely visible in the low light. My checklist included visual inspection of the bladders for leaks, checking pressure gauges, and verifying the security of the drum stacks. Each padlock was examined for tampering, and the ground around the transfer points was checked for spills. The metal surfaces of the drums and equipment were always coated in a fine layer of frost, even inside the protective berm. On this particular rotation, I parked the vehicle and began my walk-around. The cold was intense, easily a few dozen degrees below freezing. My breath plumed heavily in the beam of my headlamp. The snow underfoot was packed hard, crunching with each step. I approached the primary bladder array first, scanning the heavy canvas for any signs of stress or damage. Everything appeared normal there. Then I moved towards the drum stacks, where our backup supply was stored in individual barrels. As I rounded the corner of the berm, my headlamp beam caught something on the snow. It was a set of boot prints, clear and distinct. This was unusual. No one was scheduled for fuel work, and all personnel movements were logged. The prints led directly from the perimeter fence towards the drum stacks. They were heavy, deep impressions, suggesting a person carrying significant weight. I followed the trail, my senses heightened by the unexpected presence. The prints continued past the main bladders, heading straight for the stacked drums. The trail stopped abruptly at the first row of drums. Here the boot prints ended, replaced by a long, continuous drag mark in the snow. It was a wide, uneven furrow, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ground. The drag mark extended for several meters, then it too ceased. There was nothing at its end. No equipment, no discarded items, just undisturbed snow. The drums themselves were still in their neat rows, exactly as I had left them the previous day. No drum was missing. None appeared to have been moved. The padlock on the security gate for the drum stack was still in place. I knelt to examine the padlock. It was a heavy-duty, cold-weather model, designed to withstand extreme temperatures and resist tampering. Under the beam of my headlamp, I saw fresh scratches on the shackle and around the keyhole. They were faint but undeniable, distinct against the dull metal. Someone had attempted to force it, or at least had tried to pick it. The cold metal bit into my gloved fingers as I touched it. The air remained silent, the only sound the faint hum of my own equipment. I checked the spill tray beneath the main transfer pump. This was a shallow metal basin designed to catch any drips during fuel operations. It was empty, clean, and smelled of nothing. Normally, there would be a faint, lingering scent of diesel, even if no recent transfer had occurred. The absence of any odor was unsettling. It suggested that if someone had been here, they had been careful, or perhaps had not been interested in the fuel itself. The drag mark still bothered me. It seemed to lead nowhere, ending without explanation. I took out my station-issued camera and began to photograph the scene. Each boot print, the drag mark, the scratches on the padlock, everything was documented. The flash illuminated the frost-covered snow, making the details stark. I checked the perimeter fence again, walking its length. There were no obvious breaches, no cut wires. The snow around the fence line was undisturbed, except for the single set of tracks leading in and out. It was as if the person had simply appeared, walked to the fuel stack, created the drag mark, and then vanished. I returned to my vehicle and radioed dispatch. My voice was calm, adhering to protocol. I reported the unauthorized tracks and the evidence of tampering at the fuel stack. Dispatch acknowledged, their voice a low, static hum over the radio. They informed me that no personnel had been authorized to be in the fuel berm area. Security personnel were immediately deployed. I waited by the utility vehicle, its engine idling, headlights illuminating the strange scene. The cold seeped into the cabin, despite the heater. When the security team arrived about an hour later, they followed my initial assessment. They meticulously photographed the tracks and the padlock. They measured the boot prints, noting their size and tread pattern. The drag mark was also measured and documented. One of the officers pointed out that the drag mark was too clean, too uniform, to be a person dragging something heavy. It looked more like a deliberate attempt to create a specific impression. The officer suggested it was a decoy, a staged event. The security team conducted a wider perimeter sweep, extending several kilometers beyond the berm. They found nothing else. No other tracks, no discarded tools, no signs of a vehicle. The isolation of the station meant that any unauthorized presence was a serious breach. The incident was logged, a formal report filed. My photographs were added to the evidence file. The station commander was notified, and a heightened state of alert was declared. The fuel stack remained secure, the drums untouched. The investigation continued for several days. The boot prints were analyzed, but they matched no known station-issued footwear. The tread pattern was generic, common to many types of cold-weather boots. The drag mark remained an enigma. It was officially concluded that an unknown individual had accessed the fuel berm area, attempted to tamper with the padlock, and then left. The purpose of the drag mark was never determined. It was simply noted as an unusual detail. Life at the station returned to its routine, but the incident left a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The long night felt longer, the isolation more profound. Every perimeter check became a more intense scrutiny of the snow, the fences, the silent expanse. I still performed my duties, checking the fuel stacks, verifying the integrity of the reserves. The padlock was replaced, but the memory of those scratches remains. Sometimes, when the wind howls and the station hums, I still think about that drag mark in the snow. A trace of something that was never there, leading to nowhere. The cold air still carries a whisper of that night, a quiet reminder of an unexplained presence. I was the senior meteorology technician at Station Alpha 7, deep in the northern reaches of the Yukon Territory. My shift had just begun, settling into the familiar rhythm of the station's operations. It was the heart of the long winter night, a time of perpetual twilight and extreme cold that pressed against the thick walls of the main building. The air inside, by contrast, was dry and warm, smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. The first irregularity I noted was a faint, almost imperceptible hum on the primary HF frequency, well before the scheduled transmission window. This was unusual for that time of night, especially with the clear atmospheric conditions. I checked the radio log, but nothing was recorded for that specific band. The station was isolated, many miles from any major highway, surrounded by dense forest and frozen gravel trails. Our primary contact with the outside world was through these radio channels. I adjusted the squelch, listening closer, but the hum remained a low, steady presence beneath the usual static. It was not strong enough to trigger the automatic recording system, just a quiet, persistent vibration in the air. I made a mental note to check the antenna array during my morning rounds. The cold outside was profound, a constant reminder of our remote location. The nearest town was a journey of several hours by snowmobile, even in good conditions. This hum was a small thing, but small things often precede larger ones in such an environment. My routine at Alpha 7 was built on precision and repetition. Each day involved a series of critical tasks centered around the twice-daily launch of weather balloons. These sondes carried instruments high into the atmosphere, relaying vital data back to our ground station. The data was then compiled into detailed reports and transmitted to central forecasting offices. My workday began long before dawn, preparing the helium tanks and checking the delicate instruments. The sonde prep desk was always meticulously organized, every sensor calibrated, every battery charged. The radio room was another core component of my duties. I monitored various frequencies, logging incoming and outgoing transmissions, ensuring clear communication with other remote stations and occasional aircraft. The hum of the equipment was a constant backdrop to the quiet work. The station itself was a collection of sturdy, utilitarian buildings designed to withstand the harsh northern climate. We relied on a diesel generator for power, its low thrum a familiar sound across the compound. The nearest human presence was many miles away, making self-reliance paramount. My logbook was a meticulous record of every observation, every equipment check, every radio contact. This methodical approach was essential for maintaining the integrity of our data and the safety of our operations. There was little room for error or deviation from established protocols. The next morning, the hum was gone. I dismissed it as a minor atmospheric anomaly, or perhaps a slight equipment drift. The station was quiet, save for the low thrum of the generator outside. I began my pre-launch checks, the air in the sonde prep room cool and dry. The large helium tanks stood ready, their gauges showing full pressure. I was about to begin inflating the first balloon, preparing the delicate instruments for their ascent, when the main HF radio in the adjacent room crackled to life. This was highly unusual. The scheduled transmission for the morning forecast was still a good hour away, and no other stations were due to report. I walked over to the radio console, my boots making soft sounds on the linoleum floor. The display showed the primary weather net frequency was active, its green light glowing steadily. A calm, clear voice began to speak, delivering a standard meteorological forecast. It was a male voice, professional and measured, entirely consistent with official transmissions I had heard countless times. The content, however, was not. The voice was detailing conditions for the following day, not the current one. It described a significant drop in temperature, a heavy frost advisory, and a shift in wind direction that was not predicted for the next 24 hours. The voice continued for several minutes, outlining pressure systems and precipitation probabilities with precise, technical language. I stood there, listening intently, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with the current forecast models displayed on my own monitors. The radio log automatically began to record the transmission, marking it with the current date and time. The printer next to the console whirred, spitting out a hard copy of the spoken words. I watched the paper feed, the black text appearing line by line, each character sharp and clear. As the transmission concluded, the voice signed off with a standard identifier, one I recognized as belonging to a central forecasting office, but the call sign was slightly off, a minor variation I couldn't immediately place. The radio then went silent, leaving only the faint hiss of the open channel. I pulled the printout from the tray. The date at the top of the page was indeed tomorrow's date. The forecast detailed conditions that were not yet possible to predict with such certainty, not even for our most advanced models. The paper felt cold in my hand, the texture smooth beneath my fingertips. I reread the lines, checking for any error in my perception or any misinterpretation of the data. The details were specific. A low of nearly 40 below zero, sustained winds from the northeast at a speed faster than typical, and a significant accumulation of new snow, perhaps a foot or more. None of this was in our current projections for the next day, nor were there any indicators that such a drastic change was imminent. The implications settled over me like the cold outside, a profound sense of unease. This was a forecast for a future that had not yet been calculated, a voice speaking from a time that had not yet arrived. The silence in the room after the transmission felt heavier than before. I checked the radio's internal clock against the station's master time. Both were perfectly synchronized. There was no apparent malfunction with the equipment. The radio log confirmed the exact time of reception. The printout was undeniable evidence. My first priority was to verify the equipment. I ran a full diagnostic on the HF rig, checking every component, every connection. The system reported no errors. The antenna array outside, though covered in a light frost, appeared intact and properly aligned. I then cross-referenced the call sign from the printout with the official registry. The identifier was legitimate, but the slight variation I had noted was not listed. It was like a known address with an unfamiliar house number. I reviewed the radio log, confirming the transmission's duration and signal strength. It had been a strong, clear signal, indicating a nearby source or an exceptionally powerful broadcast. Neither explanation made sense for an unscheduled, precursive forecast. I then compared the received forecast data with our current models. The discrepancies were stark. Our models predicted a relatively stable, though cold, day ahead, with only light winds and no significant snowfall. The radio forecast described a severe weather event. I considered the possibility of a prank or a rogue transmission, but the professional tone and precise technical language argued against it. No one would go to such lengths for a joke, especially on a secure weather net. I documented everything meticulously in my logbook, attaching the printout as evidence. I took several photographs of the radio console, the log display, and the printed forecast, ensuring every detail was captured. The isolation of the station began to feel less like peaceful solitude and more like a vulnerability. I tried to contact the central forecasting office using the standard channels, but received no immediate response. The radio remained silent, save for the usual background static. I felt a growing sense of unease, a quiet dread that had nothing to do with the cold outside. This was an impossible event, a violation of the natural order of information. I considered the implications for the weather balloon launch. If the transmitted forecast was accurate, then our current data was dangerously wrong. I decided to proceed with the launch as scheduled, but with an added layer of caution. I prepared the sonde with extra care, double-checking every sensor. The balloon ascended into the dim, frozen sky, a small white dot disappearing into the low cloud cover. I monitored its telemetry, watching the data stream in. For the first few hours, the data aligned with our current models. Then, slowly, the readings began to shift. The temperature started to drop faster than predicted. The wind velocity increased, and its direction began to veer towards the northeast. The barometric pressure showed a more rapid decline. The changes were subtle at first, then became undeniable. The impossible forecast was beginning to manifest. I immediately prepared a priority report, detailing the anomalous radio transmission and the subsequent shift in observed conditions. I transmitted it to the central office, along with the photographic evidence and the radio log entries. The response was slow in coming. A few hours later, a terse acknowledgement of receipt. There was no explanation, no immediate instruction. The silence from Central Command was almost as unsettling as the original transmission. I continued to monitor the weather, watching the sky darken further, the first flakes of snow beginning to fall, just as the voice had predicted. The cold outside intensified, a biting wind picking up speed. The severe weather arrived precisely as the anomalous transmission had predicted. A blizzard descended upon the station, bringing heavy snow and winds that howled around the buildings for nearly 2 full days. The temperature plummeted to the exact low the voice had stated. Our station was effectively cut off, visibility reduced to a few feet. When the storm finally broke, the landscape was transformed, covered in a deep layer of fresh snow. The central office eventually sent a team to investigate. They reviewed my logbook, examined the radio equipment, and took copies of all my reports and photographs. They found no evidence of tampering or malfunction with the station's systems. The official report concluded that the incident was likely a rare atmospheric phenomenon, a skip transmission from an unknown source, combined with an unusual coincidence of weather patterns. The precursive nature of the forecast was dismissed as an anomaly, a statistical improbability. My detailed account of the specific call sign variation was noted but ultimately deemed insignificant. The file was closed. I was advised to continue my duties as normal. I continued my work at Alpha 7 for several more years. The station remained isolated, the long nights still stretching out. No similar incident ever occurred. Yet, sometimes, late at night, when the static is particularly heavy on the radio, I still hear it. Not the words, but the calm, measured tone of that voice, predicting a future that had not yet arrived. It is a quiet whisper in the back of my mind, a reminder of something impossible. I was monitoring the geomagnetic flux from a remote site. It was deep winter, the sun long gone from the northern sky. A faint, high-pitched hum began to resonate from the shack's metal frame. My role was instrumentation specialist for the regional geophysical network. The site was a small, insulated cabin, barely larger than a storage shed, situated many miles from the nearest highway. Inside, sensitive magnetometers recorded minute fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. Outside, the landscape was a vast, frozen expanse of boreal forest, blanketed in snow and ice. The nearest town was a small cluster of lights, a distant promise of warmth and human contact. Most nights were uneventful, a steady stream of data flowing into the main facility. My shifts involved routine checks, calibration, and ensuring the systems remained operational through the extreme cold. The isolation was profound, a constant companion in the long, dark nights. The only sounds were the wind and the low thrum of the equipment. This particular night, the aurora borealis was predicted to be unusually active. I had seen many displays over the years, vibrant curtains of light dancing across the sky. They were always beautiful, sometimes overwhelming, but rarely caused operational issues beyond minor interference. I had just completed a system check, noting the stable readings on the flux monitor. The air inside the shack was kept at a constant, comfortable temperature, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. I sat at my console, sipping a hot drink, watching the data scroll. The hum from the frame was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. I dismissed it as a minor resonance, perhaps a loose panel vibrating in the wind. The normal routine involved hourly checks of the primary flux monitor and a visual scan of the secondary readouts. I also maintained a detailed logbook, noting any anomalies or environmental changes. The facility was designed for minimal human presence, but my role was crucial for immediate response to any system alerts. The nearest human outpost was a small research cabin, about 3 miles away through the forest, occupied by a rotating team of biologists. Communication was primarily via satellite radio, a reliable but sometimes slow link to dispatch. The gravel trail leading to the shack was often impassable in heavy snow, requiring snowmobile access. Tonight, the trail was clear enough for my utility vehicle, its headlights cutting through the pervasive night. The cold outside was intense, well below freezing, the kind that made metal brittle and breath crystallize instantly. Inside the shack, the equipment hummed with a steady, low frequency, a comforting mechanical drone. I had grown accustomed to the rhythmic pulse of the systems. The data stream on the monitor was typically a series of gentle waves, indicating the Earth's normal magnetic rhythm. Any significant deviation would trigger an alert, sending a signal to my console and to the central facility. I had never experienced a full system alert during my time at this site. The quiet dread of potential equipment failure was always present, but rarely materialized. The hum intensified, growing from a whisper to a low, resonant tone. It felt less like a vibration and more like a sustained note. I checked the shack's structural integrity, running my hand along the metal doorframe. A faint static charge tingled against my skin. The flux monitor, which had been displaying a steady, undulating line, began to show erratic spikes. The needle on the analog gauge, usually a calm indicator, started to twitch. I leaned closer, my breath fogging slightly in the cooler air near the door. The digital readout flashed a warning. Geomagnetic coupling surge detected. This was not a minor interference. The aurora outside had become a blinding spectacle. Green and purple light pulsed with an unnatural intensity, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The light was so bright it seemed to penetrate the shack's small, reinforced windows, painting the interior with an eerie glow. The hum was now a palpable vibration, rattling the small tools on my workbench. A wrench slid a fraction of an inch across the metal surface. I watched, transfixed, as a small wheeled tool cart positioned near the entrance began to roll. It moved slowly, deliberately, not downhill towards the door, but uphill, away from it, towards the back wall. It traveled perhaps 2 inches before stopping. My mind struggled to process the observation. The floor was level, checked during every maintenance cycle. There was no slope, no discernible force that could account for the cart's movement. The hum deepened, becoming a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I could feel it in my teeth. The metal railing that ran along the wall, usually cold and inert, began to vibrate visibly. It emitted a sound like static trying to sing, a high-pitched, almost musical whine layered over the deep hum. The sound was disorienting, a cacophony of mechanical distress and something else, something resonant and alive. The flux monitor's needle pegged, slamming against the maximum limit of its range. The digital display flickered, then went blank. All secondary systems began to fail, one by one. The internal lights dimmed, then brightened erratically, as if struggling against an unseen force. I tried to contact dispatch on the satellite radio, but the signal was dead, replaced by a burst of pure static. The cold outside seemed to seep into the shack, despite the insulation. I could feel the chill radiating from the walls, a profound, unnatural cold that seemed to bypass the air temperature. The air itself felt charged, heavy with an unseen energy. I grabbed my emergency flashlight. The primary power had failed. The backup generator, usually reliable, remained silent. The only light now came from the pulsing aurora outside, filtering through the windows and the beam from my flashlight. The hum persisted, a deep, resonant chord that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath the shack. I moved cautiously towards the door, my hand brushing against the metal railing. It was vibrating violently, almost painfully against my palm. The static sensation was stronger now, a prickling across my skin. I could hear a faint, high-pitched whine accompanying the hum, like a distant, distorted siren. I needed to check the external power conduit, a thick, armored cable running from the shack to the main power pole about 50 yards away. Stepping outside, the cold hit me with physical force. The aurora was still blazing, a silent, furious storm of light. The snow crunched loudly under my boots, the only sound apart from the pervasive hum that now seemed to fill the entire forest. I could feel it in the ground, a low tremor that vibrated up through my legs. The power pole stood stark against the glowing sky. As I approached, I noticed a faint, blue-white corona shimmering around the top of the pole. It was a silent discharge, an electrical phenomenon I had only ever seen in textbooks. The power conduit itself was vibrating. I could see the thick cable oscillating slightly, a subtle, rhythmic movement. I pulled out my thermal imager. The cable was glowing with an unnatural heat, far beyond what normal current flow would generate. The pole itself registered an extremely high temperature, almost radiating heat into the frigid air. I knew then that the surge was not just affecting the shack. It was a widespread, powerful event. The magnetic field was not just fluctuating. It was being violently distorted, creating an immense electrical current. I took a photograph of the glowing pole with my emergency camera, the flash momentarily cutting through the aurora's light. I returned to the shack, the hum now a constant, oppressive presence. The satellite radio remained unresponsive. I tried the emergency hand crank radio, but it too only produced static. My only option was to wait for the surge to pass, or for dispatch to send a team. I knew the latter would take hours, given the distance and the conditions. I checked the logbook, making careful notes of the time and the observed phenomena. The cart movement, the railing hum, the power failure, the glowing pole. I documented everything with a procedural detachment, trying to maintain a sense of control in an environment that felt increasingly alien. The hum slowly began to recede after what felt like an eternity. The aurora outside softened, its violent pulses diminishing to a more familiar, gentle sway. The internal lights flickered back on, weak at first, then steady. The flux monitor remained blank for a few minutes, then slowly rebooted, displaying erratic but no longer pegged readings. I re-established contact with dispatch, reporting the full extent of the incident. They had received similar reports from other remote sites, though none as severe as mine. An RCMP patrol was dispatched to check on my well-being and to assess the damage. The patrol arrived a few hours later, their headlights cutting through the lingering fog. The officers were visibly shaken by the reports from other sites. They took my detailed report, examined the logbook, and photographed the tool cart, still resting a few inches from its original position. The railing had cooled, but a faint metallic scent lingered in the air. The power pole showed no residual glow, but the thermal imager still registered elevated temperatures. The official report attributed the incident to an unprecedented geomagnetic storm, a rare and powerful event. The file was marked as a natural phenomenon, an act of nature. I still work at the same facility, though I have not been assigned to that specific shack since. The data from that night was analyzed extensively, confirming the extreme nature of the surge. I sometimes review the photographs I took, the glowing power pole a stark reminder. I still hear the hum sometimes, a low, resonant note in the quiet of the night. It's a sound that stays with you, a whisper of something vast and indifferent.